You are listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 12th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist, and I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up,
we'll also be working with our international partners and friends, and if it comes to that, our response, of course, will be firm and clear.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau meets with partners in Brussels today as Canada and the European Union look to stand up to Donald Trump's fresh round of tariffs. From there to Sudan, where government forces are claiming to retake the capital from rebels, we'll ask what this means for the country's long civil war. After that,
I don't think technology is ever democratized. That's a myth. Yes, of course you have access to technology, but technology doesn't make the world more equal. Technology actually has made the world more unequal in many ways.
The Dean of Oxford's Business School speaks to us at the World Government Summit in Dubai. We'll also explore why Denmark's centre-left government has achieved record low levels of migration. We'll have the newspapers and a Balkans roundup with Guy Delany. That's all up ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that a Gaza ceasefire will end if Hamas does not release further hostages on Saturday. U.S. President Donald Trump has doubled down on his promise for the U.S. to take control of Gaza in a meeting with Jordan's King Abdullah at the White House. And American Mark Fogel has been released from a Russian prison and greeted by President Trump upon his return to Washington. Another unnamed American detainee is slated to be released later on Wednesday. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. But first, Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has promised, as you heard at the top of the show, a stiff response to Donald Trump's latest round of tariffs, a 25% hit on steel and aluminum imports from around the world. Trudeau has been in Europe this week and later today in Brussels will likely be trying to coordinate that response with the European Union. Either that or find a way of de-escalating the whole situation. Well, let's hear first of all from Monocle's Toronto correspondent Thomas Lewis, who sent us this report.
Well, the backdrop to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's visit to Europe over these past few days, which concludes in Brussels today, when he'll meet with leaders, representatives of the European Union, as well as with the NATO Secretary-General. The backdrop back at home in Canada, in terms of the public mood at least, is still one of close to universal anger at the United States and at US President Donald Trump and his manoeuvres against Canada's economy during the past 2 weeks or so. The tariffs initially announced by President Trump, those universal import levies, 25% on all Canadian imports into the US, well, those may have been paused for now until the end of March. But these latest announcements of a 25% tariff on all imports of steel and aluminium on Canada just add to the collective fury I think a lot of people feel in Canada, particularly in those sectors, because Canada is the largest supplier of steel and aluminium into the US market. So it's likely the US manufacturers are going to feel any trouble in that supply chain pretty keenly themselves as well. Now, it's been reported in the Canadian press that during the International AI Summit that was hosted in Paris over the past few days, Prime Minister Trudeau did manage to grab some words with the US Vice President, who is also there, J.D. Vance. And it's been reported that the Prime Minister, in his conversation with J.D. Vance, the US Vice President, try to hammer home the impact that any kind of levy on Canadian steel and aluminium would have on the economy of his home state, Ohio. It seems that Ohio is one of the biggest importers of Canadian goods of any of the US states. It's worth about $21 billion a year, I believe, that trade. So trying to take a personal route to the Vice President there. But I think more broadly, what Justin Trudeau is trying to do is to shore up existing relationships and existing agreements. It was in 2016 that the EU and Canada signed what is called in shorthand CETA, the Comprehensive Economic Free Trade Agreement. But that hasn't been put into full effect, given that there are around 10 member states in Europe who still haven't fully ratified that deal. I think the mood and the appetite to try and diversify Canada's economic relationships is so high at the moment that we're expecting the Prime Minister to do as much as he can, frankly, to try and push the importance, given that the EU appears to be in the tariff sights of US President Donald Trump as well, just how useful that relationship it is, if it is fully put into action, could be for both parties.
Thomas Lewis in Toronto, thank you very much for that. And we're joined now for more on the European side of things by Suzanne Lynch, Global Playbook author and associate editor at Politico in Brussels. Suzanne, great to have you back on the show. You did hear of Canada's anger from Thomas there. How much trepidation is there in Brussels?
Well, good morning. There's a lot of anxiety here about what is to come from the United States, and a sense, an expectation even, that the European Union is next in Donald Trump's sights. He has said as much. The US president has said that he will hit the EU. Obviously, steel and aluminium are something that he's already announced, and that will affect the EU, but also that it could be subject to further sanctions, some kind of sectoral sanctions perhaps, because the reality is that in goods, the trade of goods, the EU has a surplus with the United States, and Donald Trump is not happy with that. He wants to change that. So very much a sense here that something is coming. Now, we did see yesterday, again, at this AI summit in Paris, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, she had a sit-down meeting with J.D. Vance, the vice president. It was interesting, though, just before that meeting, she put out what, by EU standards, is quite a heavy-hitting statement, promising firm action against the US if they impose tariffs. So, for example, that's a lot stronger than the UK did. The UK, for example, have not said that. They've said we'll wait and see. So I think the EU is trying to balance, yes, we want to find a deal, but we will ultimately hit back if we have to.
Suzanne, to that point then, is it your understanding when you speak to people in Brussels that at this point they don't really believe there's much that they could do to head this off, that there isn't some kind of response that they can give Donald Trump, whether that's investments in the United States, other ways of maybe shifting the trade balance somewhat, that these tariffs are coming and that the EU will have to respond?
Well, I think the feeling is that they're coming, but whether it may be, as just happened in Canada, they're announced and then there is a possibility that they could be pulled back in some way. So I think there is some discussions about there definitely are some discussions about what the EU could offer Canada. The United States. So, for example, one issue is LNG. European Commission President has said, Ursula von der Leyen has said several times that the EU could buy more US LNG gas. There's also been discussion about, buying more US defense equipment and that kind of thing. And that might come up as an issue later in this week at the Munich Security Conference. And we're going to have a big US delegation and an EU delegation. That's a big defense conference. I think what might be tricky, though, was that yesterday at the AI summit, J.D. Vance hit out at overregulation of big tech. And this has long been a bugbear of US companies, but it has intensified under this Trump administration. The US would like the EU to back off on regulation of big tech. I think that's going to be a very difficult thing for the EU to do. It's already introduced new laws, the DSA and the DMA Act. These are complicated laws that regulate tech companies, and the European public, by and large, support that. So, it remains to be seen how big of an issue that one is, for example. But perhaps LNG in particular, people here believe that that's a big issue for Donald Trump. If he feels that the EU is committed to buying more American, that might soften the blow in some way.
Now, Suzanne, on the flip side of that, I mean, with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Brussels as well, if you put Canada and the European Union together, I mean, we are talking about two massive economies that can have a major effect on the US economy. So I do wonder if that is something that's in the mind of the European Union and Brussels as well, kind of shifting this conversation also to say to Trump, if you do this, you're going to be impacted. The US economy is going to be impacted as well.
Yes, I mean, I think there is. I mean, Canada is an ally of the EU. It's a member of the G7. It's a member of NATO, and Justin Trudeau will be meeting the NATO Secretary General here as well today in Brussels. Absolutely, I think I'm not to overstate this, but I think there is a small bit of confidence on the EU side that the EU itself is a big trading bloc. You know, it's something, it can inflict damage on the US. When it comes to maybe defense and security, no, Europe needs America when it comes to what happens next in Ukraine, for example. But with trade, the EU did impose retaliatory sanctions the last time on the United States when those steel and aluminium tariffs were announced during the first Trump presidency. So trade is kind of something that the EU is good at. It's got lots of officials in the European Commission. That's its competency. It's not the EU individual member states. This is what the EU does. Stuff about the single market and trade. In saying that, I do think that as well as this what we've seen from Trudeau and the Canadians, the ideal scenario is that this is avoided. And I think there is going to be a lot of conversation about how that might happen. But yes, I think that's very much going to be a topic of discussion when Trudeau meets these leaders here today.
Just finally, Suzanne, also when it comes to Canada, you heard Thomas Lewis talking about Canada's own free trade deal with the European Union, which has been held up and remains unratified by 10 nations. It does make me wonder whether Europe is pro-free trade at this point as a bloc, or is what's happening with Donald Trump making it sort of rethink that, or is Europe also, frankly, somewhat protectionist when it comes to free trade right now?
No, I don't think so. I mean, reality elements, even though it hasn't been ratified, that's correct. The CETA agreement, it's kind of in practice effectively. So I think what we've seen in the EU actually over the last few months is that the promise or the possibility of a Donald Trump presidency had forced the EU, which can move at a glacial pace, to actually sign a number of trade agreements with other places. For example, the Mercosur, which is South American countries, that trade deal had been negotiated for years. There was a lot of opposition to it in France. And Ursula von der Leyen and the Commission overrode concerns by President Macron and signed that deal. We also saw a smaller one with Mexico. So I think to your earlier point as well, you know, you're right in that I think different allies are going to start looking at how they can coordinate better, how they can trade more, because America is becoming more nationalist, more protectionist, and it has signaled its resistance to free trade. So I do think that is, you know, focusing minds a lot more here.
Suzanne Lynch of Politico in Brussels, thank you very much for joining us. This is The Globalist. It is 9:12 a.m. in Khartoum and 7:12 a.m. here in London. Sudan's military claims that it is near recapturing the country's capital, Khartoum, from rebel forces, and is billing the progress as a major turning point in a 2-year civil war. But not everyone is convinced. Even if Khartoum is recaptured, it does leave Sudan effectively split in two, with much of the west still controlled by rebel forces, all while the African Union has just labelled Sudan the world's worst humanitarian disaster. So are there any fresh hopes that this devastating civil war will come to an end? Well, I'm joined now by Hafiz Mohammed, Director of Justice Africa Sudan, an advocacy organization and research institute founded in Khartoum. Hafiz, thank you very much for coming on the show. Can you tell us first of all of the situation as you understand it in Khartoum itself?
Oh, thank you for having me. The situation, the government forces Sudan armed forces managed to take back some areas used to be controlled by the rapid support force. But still some many areas within the capital is still under the control of the rapid support force. They haven't actually, throw them out of the capital totally. And they have the supply route, which is coming through Al-Ubaid Bara route, which is from Durman, part of the capital, Khartoum, state of Khartoum. They're still having the supply route open, rapid support force, and they are still controlling some part of the capital. That means, the war is not over yet. It's still there. And there's still some element from the rapid support road within Jazira's state. Yes, they managed to clear them from many parts of Al Jazeera, but that is still there, and that are still fighting.
And Hafiz, I mean, if there is still fighting going on, as you say, even if that might change in the coming days and weeks, and say Khartoum is retaken by the armed forces, is that, in your mind, is it a symbolic victory? Is it anything more than that? Could it actually shift momentum in this conflict?
I don't think so, because the magnitude of destruction is huge, and the country is ungovernable. This Sudan, without a huge support from the international community, is not governable. Even the only way out is to have a restore peace, because now not only the rapid support force which is carrying arms, everyone is have an arm, and there is a state of lawlessness within the capital, within Sudan, all Sudan. Still, all the roads are not safe. Even going in the eastern part of Sudan and the north is not also safe, because there is too many people actually carrying arms, and with the police and the army and other security forces are also exhausted because of the war. And it is really difficult to manage the country without having a national reconciliation and also a cessation of hostility and peace agreement. Unless we have that, then I don't think the country is governable, because the level of destruction, the infrastructure, to all the services, the education, the health, universities, everything is destroyed. They need huge amounts of money. They need Sudanese to come together. Unless that happens, I don't think the proliferation, which is the polarization now, is going to help, because now the Sudanese community society is totally polarized in tribal, ethnic line, and I think that have to be sorted out. That is the biggest challenge which is facing Sudanese political elites.
And Hafiz, when you talk about that challenge and the need for peace, is there anything that can be done from the outside? Because there are regional players involved in this. The United Arab Emirates, which is reported to have backed the rebels, although it denies that, is calling now for a ceasefire, although the army has rejected that. I mean, do we expect any of these outside parties to be able to exercise some influence to bring Sudan closer to peace?
The regional and international community tries their best, but the problem is inside Sudan. I think there is some element, especially within the former ruling NCP, National Congress Party, and some generals who are actually insisting on fighting their way out. And that is the problem. The problem is not outside. The problem is inside. And people start blaming the United Arab Emirates and other elements also. I think all the international regional interventions, some of them are actually very negative. But the international community have tried. But the Sudanese, especially some part of for Sudan government, they are insisting on fighting it out. They believe that the only way out is to fight it. They eliminate their opponent, whether they are the civilians or the military. And then to stay in power. But that will never work. That would only cause more destruction and more division within the society, which is already divided.
And just finally, Hafiz, I wonder if you could describe a bit of the humanitarian situation, which is, of course, incredibly difficult at the moment. The African Union has called this the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Is any aid getting in, whether it's Khartoum or other parts of the country? There is, of course, in addition to all of this, USAID being pulled back as well.
There is too many problems. First of all, is the security problem. To be able to move aid around, that is a serious challenge and serious problem for the humanitarian organization. And people, and even the local mobilized groups like the Kias and others, they have problems because they don't have resources. This is one problem. There is no resources in Sudan. Even the international humanitarian organization, they only have less than 20% of what they need in terms of resources to provide assistance to more than 30 million Sudanese who are really in desperate need, because most of the country infrastructure of the economy are actually collapsing. People are not working. The government is not paying salaries. Economy is not functioning. all these causing problems, and we need to use sum of money. Yes, the suspension of the US aid to generally is actually have an impact, because more than 30% of the aid which is coming to Sudan used to be funded by the United States, and now that almost stopped. And the international, there is actually fatigue from funding Sudan, because the international and the regional community keep actually sending humanitarian assistance, and this war is endless. It's just continuing, and I think more people are going to suffer if this war, doesn't stop just within a month or two. I think many people are going to suffer, and the magnitude of the humanitarian crisis is going to increase. I totally agree with the statement of the African Union. It's just crisis beyond description, and I think the war has to stop first, so we'll be able to sort the security and even the few aid which is coming, so they can move it around and to people in desperate need.
Hafiz Mohammed, Director of the Justice Africa Sudan, thank you very much for joining us on a difficult topic. Still to come in the programme.
I'm Monocle's man in the Balkans, Guy Delornay. Brace yourselves for a roundup from the region that includes Italy's Albanian asylum misadventure and Zagreb's gallery of giggle.
Looking forward to that from Guy. This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
You are back with The Globalist, and let's continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Inga Thoradara, Chief External Relations Officer at the Oceanborn Foundation and former Senior Editor at BBC and CNN. Good morning, Inga.
Good morning, Chris. Nice to be here.
Yes, very good to have you here. We are going to start with something I mentioned in the headlines a little bit. There's a lot of news out of Gaza at the moment, both on sort of the state of the ceasefire and King Abdullah's meeting with Donald Trump. But let's talk about the ceasefire. Do we have any feeling right now of optimism that this will hold?
Well, it's very difficult to see that. If you look at, most newspapers are leading on this story. And optimism seems to be fading a little bit. Netanyahu, Israel Prime Minister Netanyahu has warned that the current ceasefire will be terminated if they don't release the hostages. Now, interestingly, we don't know if he means the hostages from the first phase, i.e. the whole 33, of which 16 have been released, or if he means all of them, which is what we understood from Trump when he spoke on Monday. So that is still sort of unclear. Of course, on the other side, Hamas is saying, well, we're not going to release them unless you stick to your agreement, which was providing tent and shelter and humanitarian aid into Gaza, which Hamas says Israel has not done adequately. I just want to mention the story from AP, which I think is really important, is that, this is an incredibly anxious time for the people of these hostages. They are pleading to the Prime Minister Netanyahu,
the families,
and the Israeli government to stick to the framework of the ceasefire, because they already know that their loved ones are there. There's been proof of life of more than the ones that have just been released, and they are hoping that they will return to them after more than 16 months in captivity.
This is what's quite striking about this whole thing, isn't it? Because you would think that actually both sides at this point want a ceasefire to continue, but we're not necessarily getting that sense.
That's true. There are definitely factions within the Israeli government who would not want a ceasefire, who actually want to continue and say what they've finished, what they've started. And then, of course, they have Trump on there making the statements that he's making about Gaza as well. So I think that there is a momentum within that faction that things could continue. But you mentioned King Abdullah, who met Donald Trump in the White House yesterday. He has been very clear that, you're not going to evacuate Gaza or any of those plans that Trump has come up with and move those people, the Palestinians, to neighboring countries. So this remains, as it has been for decades, a very complex situation. But it does feel like the ceasefire could just be on the edge of breaking. But let's hope that there are some good news in the coming days.
Let's hope so. But let's focus on another story for now. BP, you have news of them moving away from renewable energy.
Yeah, a lot of focus has been on the BP and their, terrible outcome and their profits dropping sharply and focusing on the sort of economics of it. But I saw a piece on the BBC where they were really talking about what this means for their $10 billion commitment to renewable energy, which they now say that they're going to slash by 50%. I mean, that is incredible given that, infrastructure and the need for investment in infrastructure and renewable energy is exactly what the world needs right now to fight climate changes. But BP needs to focus on profit, and there is a massive pressure from investors and to kind of bring this on, especially these activist shareholder Elliott Management, who wants to push for more oil and gas investment. And they seem to be listening to that more than they are listening to our planet.
It is interesting at the same time, I have to ask whether it seemed like there was a point where renewable energy was seen as something profitable and that this was sort of the future, both for the planet, but also that companies were leaning into it. Do we get the sense that that is changing? Is that partly because of Trump and regulations or other reasons?
Oh, no, that is definitely changing. I mean, the mood music around it is quite different from what it was a few years ago. But the cost of deprioritizing renewable energy will be huge in the future. I mean, looking at sort of short-term profit versus long-term benefits is going to be, well, exactly that, short-sighted and not going to help us. I mean, it could hinder progress towards, a low-carbon future, significant challenges for governments and businesses, and green jobs that have been created could be at risks, etc. So, I mean, we've seen other companies move away from it. Shell has recently announced it, ExxonMobil, Total Energy, Equinor in Norway. They all seem to be moving a bit away from these investments because, of course, you are building a completely new infrastructure that works on a completely different grid. So it's going to cost money, and profits will most likely have to be sacrificed. There doesn't seem to be an appetite for that at the moment.
Well, speaking of profits and deregulation, we did also want to talk about the AI summit that was in Paris. J.D. Vance was there, of course, as well as a number of European leaders were, and they didn't really agree on the way forward, particularly, did they?
No, I don't think this is exactly the ending that President Macron was hoping for. Both the UK and US, for very different reasons, refused to sign the final declaration of it. The UK said it was focusing on national priority and broader approach to AI governance, and said that they wanted to, support these initiatives, such as what they call the Coalition for Sustainable AI, which is focusing on aligning AI with environmental and social responsibility. Now, the US, of course, has been extremely vocal, and J.D. Vance did not mince his words when he came up and spoke about regulations in the EU. He very much believes that the European approach is too stringent and that it should be what he think. I think he said we should meet AI regulation with optimism and caution, but not stifle the sort of progress of it.
The innovation of it.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. And so he definitely didn't have a few words for the EU and actually left before the Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen spoke. So he had a very clear message for the EU from the US again.
We should say they did meet privately, but aside from that, when it came to the summit, yes, he didn't necessarily listen. I mean, do you get the sense that there is such a different approach at the moment? It is interesting because, I mean, even Ursula von der Leyen and Macron as well, I mean, they do want AI to have a future in Europe too.
Yeah, no, they do. But they, and I mean, we should, I think the history has taught us that approaching technology with caution and understanding and openness is a good thing. But you also have to start to figure out what could come with it. And I mean, we know that there are problems with AI, I mean, the data that it's pulling from is complicated, etc. So, looking at regulation is not necessarily a bad thing. So the EU's approach could well result in better AI in the future.
Well, just finally, Inga, you do have one story for us about how we can all help to find rare daffodils.
Yes, the Royal Horticultural Society here in the UK is sending us all on a treasure hunt. And as you say, not for gold, but for daffodils. So they have identified three rare species of daffodils that they fear could be lost. But they are also thinking that they could have been planted in gardens and parks a long, long time ago, and therefore might come up now in the spring, when the spring finally arrives here in the UK. Now, the most common daffodils are yellow, but what they want us to look out for are varieties that are white, orange, and salmon pink. And I mean, this was a new thing for me, but I mean, we all know what the daffodils look like and they bring us so much joy in spring, but they are also so important for science. And for example, they are a source of galantamine, which that is used in Alzheimer's medicine. So they want these plants preserved and helped. So hopefully, as the spring comes, we can all spot the salmon pink and white daffodils.
They're calling out to all gardeners out there to help them with this project. What should we do if we do find them?
Oh, I think you need to notify them, because what they want to do is basically breed them, to make sure that they're not lost. So if you see any of them, I would contact them straight away.
Budding gardeners out there, look at your garden, see what kind of daffodils you can find to help. Inga Thurdar, thank you very much for joining us here on The Globalist. And now here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that a Gaza ceasefire will end if Hamas does not release further hostages on Saturday. The Palestinian militant group earlier this week said it was suspending further hostage releases and accused Israel of violating the ceasefire terms. U.S. President Donald Trump, meanwhile, doubled down on his promise for the U.S. to take control of Gaza in a meeting with Jordan's King Abdullah at the White House. Abdullah says he reiterated Jordan's steadfast opposition to the displacement of Palestinians. We'll have more on both those stories on the briefing later today. The American high school teacher and former diplomat Mark Fogel has been released from Russian prison and greeted by President Trump upon his return. Trump said another unnamed American detainee would be released on Wednesday. It is unclear what Russia has received in return. And 5-year-old Monty has become the first giant schnauzer to win Best in Show at the Westminster Kennel Club Dog Show. The runner-up in the 149-year-old contest was a 9-year-old whippet named Bourbon. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, the Dubai World Government Summit officially opened yesterday, and Monocle's own radio booth has been up and running throughout the first days of the conference. And I'm joined now from Dubai by Monocle's head of radio, Tom Edwards. Tom, great to have you back on the program. What's the mood over there after the first full day?
Hi, Chris. Good morning to you from Dubai. The mood remains sunny, Chris, both literally and metaphorically. I mentioned yesterday, it's obviously, as a London dweller, it's nice to be somewhere where the sun is shining. But there's a sunny mood. There's still a great deal of optimism, and we were reflecting on this yesterday on Monocle Radio. No avoiding the thorny issues, the challenges that are facing everyone. Lots of talk, of course, about navigating tension and volatility. But there is such a positive sort of can-do spirit and atmosphere about all the guests we've spoken to. And this doesn't matter whether they're working for government, whether they're in public health, whether they're in hospitality, whether they're starting and running their own businesses or scale-ups. There is a really sort of positive narrative that seems to underpin all of the sessions. It's been great, and there's been a lot of interest, as you mentioned, in our in the Monocle Cafe and the excellent coffee, but also in coming to talk to us here in our booth in the square at the centre of the WGS.
And Tom, when you talk about that positive mood, it's always interesting going to summits in a completely different part of the world. I remember going to the Antalya Diplomacy Forum, things like that as well. And you really do sometimes get this feeling, right, that maybe there's a Western doom and gloom that isn't felt in other parts of the world. Is that what you're sensing over there? Where is this coming from?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point, Chris, which is that what we have throughout the UAE here in Dubai is a real understanding of the power of convening. And I think actually what Dubai, and I was here last year for the Sustainable Cities Forum as well, and it was very much in evidence there. There's a real interest in galvanizing truly global players to come together at the table. It's very flat here. So yes, you'll have key leaders in the big Western, US and global corporates, but the global south is equally well represented, and I think that's what brings a different kind of energy to the place. And that sense, I think, of people willing to engage and talk, you can kind of literally see or hear. Sometimes you're drawn into, those interesting bilaterals that happen on the margins. There's a real sense of things getting done. It's not just a talking shop. I think there's lots of great discussions that happen. but there's also lots of focus and lots of action that results, which is interesting. In terms of some of the key themes I mentioned yesterday and still in my chats today, Chris, so far, AI is everywhere. It's inescapable, and its tentacles are being felt, again, through those same trades and businesses and sectors that I mentioned earlier. We've met some great friends in hospitality. Really interesting on the trends there. We're going to hear, actually, I know on the show in a moment, from one of the people that Andrew Tuck spoke to yesterday on his panels that he was chairing and moderating about leadership. Super interesting in terms of how leaders in that field are engaging their audiences. Really interesting stuff, and obviously we'll hear that in a moment or two.
We will. That will be Soumitra Dutta of Oxford University's Business School. And I did want to ask you, based on that too, you've spoken as well, I know, with sort of business school leaders and deans. What are they teaching their students at this kind of delicate moment in the world?
Well, I think, Chris, one of the things that they're really trying to underscore is that you shouldn't shirk away from complexity, and actually by committing to continue learning, you can achieve powerful results. And I think there's a real sense that there's a real almost relentless optimism from those leaders, because they're at that coalface and they're seeing tomorrow's leaders. Maybe they're only in their mid to late 20s or early 30s now. They're supplementing their existing knowledge and experience with MBA qualifications, but their outlook is truly global, and it is almost uniformly relentlessly optimistic, which was music to our ears. The other nice thing though, Chris, just to reflect on briefly before we hear from Soumitra, is the mix, the Catholic mix of themes and topics. And I'll just mention one of my favourite conversations that I've had so far, which was with Mitsuhara Kurokawa, who's the 18th, yes, you heard me correctly, 18th generation running the Torea Confectionery Company in Tokyo. Chris Chomak, listen to this. They've been making sweets, including for the royal house, for 500 years. Isn't that extraordinary? Not the conversation I thought I was going to have, but just absolutely amazing. And I think it speaks to the willingness here at WGS to bring in crazy stakeholders that you wouldn't imagine, who actually all have something really genuinely interesting and maybe quite sweet to say about things.
That is some incredible variety that you're bringing us, Tom, from the World Government Summit. Tom Edwards, Monocle's head of radio and host of The Entrepreneurs. Thank you very much for joining us. And let's hear now from Soumitra Dutta, Dean of the Saïd School of Business at the University of Oxford. He spoke with Andrew Tuck, Monocle's editor-in-chief, and Tom Edwards in Dubai, and they began by discussing his history with the summit.
I've been coming to WGS for, almost 10 years now, actually. I think the first few editions were very small, pretty local, I would say. And now what has happened is this mushroomed into this whole global meet. I think, what has succeeded in doing, attracting some of the leaders around the world. It's actually great. It just shows, I think, how the region is booming and a lot of excitement about things, what is happening. And the region also, I feel, is assuming more of a leadership position in some key areas. AI is a good topic in this context, yeah.
There is maybe a little bit of a vacuum sort of at the top in terms of global leadership, some key players advocating to unilateralism, which is rather unhelpful in fixing the complex problems we possess. But that provides a great opportunity, doesn't it, for enlightened leaders, whether they're in the private or the public sector.
Well, I think, Dubai in particular has become like a magnet for talent from around the world. It's one of the top destinations for talent, for rich people, for wealth, in many, many different ways. But I think more than that, what I've seen in the region, because I've been in the region off and on for 25 years, and what I've seen is the increased sense of confidence, increased sense of more awareness of the position of the region in the world, and increased awareness that the region can lead and is leading in some parts of, some key parts of the economy. And I think that shows, so essentially what you see out here is that people come here because you can learn from, the region itself. Of course, you have other people you meet, but also there's increased excitement about what's happening out here in some areas, not in all, but many areas, lots of exciting things happening.
Soumitra, we were on stage earlier on today talking about networks. We won't talk about that first, but what was interesting when you talked today and when we had a chat a few days ago, you keep in a really wonderful way, coming back to like problem solving, the big problems of the world, that you're running a business school where you obviously feel it's part of your responsibility is to train people to think about how you tackle some of the biggest problems facing the world, the challenges, whether it's climate, whether it's energy, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare. At the business school, how important is that you don't just think about the paycheck and the promotion, but you think about the ambition and the potential of being a great business leader?
Yeah, I think, this is increasingly a very key topic for all business schools, especially at Oxford, because Oxford is one of those unique places where the university has always sort of had some unique values. A good case in point is what happened in the pandemic. The Oxford, of course, made the vaccine based on deep research, but it mandated and required the partner to offer the vaccine at cost price in emerging markets. So it made a very definite trade-off between saving lives and giving up millions of dollars or pounds in revenues or in royalties. And that's the kind of values which is very inherent also in the business school. Now today, businesses and business leaders are making important decisions in a variety of different ways and affecting the lives of thousands, millions of people around the world. And what we try to tell our students and executives who come to our school is that they have to realize that with their decisions, with the simple maybe Excel-based spreadsheet kind of decision that they're making, the impact goes far, far beyond impacts such as the lives of hundreds and thousands of people that they actually impact. And so it's very important that they have to start looking at the human impact of their decisions. Increasingly, given the climate crisis, they also have to take into consideration the impact on nature and the world that the decisions actually are having. And those kinds of realizations are built into the educational curriculum right now. So we're actually focusing on trying to make sure that people don't just learn the basics of finance, but also learn what is sustainable finance, how you actually make financial decisions, how do you impact investing. And these are the kind of things which I think makes Oxford special. I really believe that.
You talked today on stage about the democratizing of intelligence becoming cheaper, of everybody having access to the possibility of furthering their lives because of AI. Do you buy that? Or do you think that actually it's going to be much more choppy than that actually the places that have the data centers and the energy are still going to be the power brokers in this game?
So if you look at technology in general, over the decades, technology has increased inequality. It hasn't decreased inequality. And that's the surprising thing that most people don't realize, because most people think, everyone has the mobile phones, the technology has equalized society. But you look at the differences, they've increased in the world mainly because technology has a multiplier effect. So people who are richer typically have societies that are richer, typically have better technology, they have higher skills, and they have more resources, and they're able to combine that with technology to create higher value. Societies that are poor, or people who are poorer, essentially have, lesser good technology or less good technology. They have a smaller amount of resources, they have smaller networks, they have lower levels of education, and they do create value with technology, but they create less value. And because technology is a multiplier, the people at the top, they create far more value than the people at the bottom. And over time, that gap keep getting increased. So now the same thing is happening with AI. You're finding, of course, some companies and some countries are going to create enormous values with AI and the progress in AI. Others will get some value. I'm not saying they'll get zero value. They'll get some value, but proportionately less. So if you ask the question, is the gap going to increase between those that have the capacity to leverage it better? Answer is yes. So I think it's going to create a more unequal world, and that's the challenge. I don't think technology is ever democratized. That's a myth. Yes, of course you have access to technology, but technology doesn't make the world more equal. Technology actually has made the world more unequal in many ways.
Soumitra Dutta of Oxford Saïd Business School speaking with Andrew Tuck and Tom Edwards there. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
You are back with the Globals. The time is now 7:44 a.m. in London and 8:44 a.m. in Copenhagen, which is where we head next. Because Denmark has this week announced that the number of asylum seekers entering the country has reached a historic low. This is thanks to an anti-immigration platform of the country's Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, since coming to power in 2019. But what's interesting is that Frederiksen hails from the centre-left Social Democrats, not the far-right typically associated with a harder line on asylum seekers. And I'm joined now by Monocle's Copenhagen correspondent, Michael Booth, for more on this. Michael, has it been as simple as Denmark closing its borders, or is there something more to this?
No, it's not. They haven't really closed their borders. One explanation is there simply have been fewer asylum-seeking applications to Denmark in recent years, for obvious reasons. Previously, the biggest year was 2015, and that was a massive shock for all of Europe, of course. But about 10,000 Syrians applied for asylum in Denmark then. Since then, as you mentioned, we've had a new Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, who did come to power on a kind of anti-immigration platform to tighten things up. But there have simply been fewer applications in the last few years. 860 people were accepted last year. That's down from 2,300 the year before in 23. But we should also remember the Danes have accepted 40,000 Ukrainian refugees on special kind of terms. So they're allowed to work in the country and so forth. But definitely Denmark over the last 20 years on immigration has, of course, moved to the right. And the message has gone out around the world that the Danes are not as open to immigration as they have been, and they're certainly not as open to immigration as their neighbours, the Swedes to the north, who, of course, have also tightened up on immigration very much in the last couple of years.
And how would you describe Prime Minister Frederiksen's approach? Again, the fact that she is a social democrat as well, when it comes to either this sort of the lesser amount of asylum seekers coming into the country, but also the approach to integration of those that are already there. How is she tackling this?
Well, I mean, if you were of a cynical frame, you would notice that in the early 2000s, her Social Democratic Party were the first party to really take a look at their voters and see who they are and analyse them and have focus groups. It sounds ridiculous that they were so late to that, but that only really started in Denmark in the early 2000s. And what they discovered was, the Social Democrats, was that they needed to focus on a small number of voters who the Danish People's Party, the Dansk Party, were winning and having great success with in the early 2000s. They were up to nearly 20% of the vote back then. And these were older people from more provincial areas, maybe not with university education and so on. And in a way, they were the core voters for the Social Democrats who had moved over to the Danish People's Party, because the Danish People's Party were not a traditional right-wing party in the sense that they still supported the state and the welfare state and pensions in particular, and they were advocating more care for the elderly and those kind of things. And then the Social Democrats have basically just taken on those clothes in the last 8 years or so and had great success. So both of these parties, the far right and the centre, after these core, certainly we're talking about a couple of 10, 20,000 voters who can sway an election, because just as everywhere else, it's older people who are voting and older people who they can reach through, the traditional media.
And Michael, to that point of focus groups, and very interesting the way you're suggesting what sort of Frederiksen and the Social Democrats have done. Mette Frederiksen also has advice for what she called the woke left of Europe, which is, of course, also interesting for a politician from the left. What is her advice to them?
Well, yeah, I mean, what's interesting is, you wonder what the EU thinks about what Denmark is doing. But of course, if you look across all the nation states in the EU, they're all, or many of them, are moving or have moved to the right on immigration, which means that Denmark is not an outlier anymore, especially when you look at their near neighbour like the Dutch. And as I said, even the Swedes now, Germany, Italy, and France is wobbling as well towards the right. So there's a sense that this is the new normal. And while the EU used to finger wag a lot and criticise the Danes in the early 2000s, particularly for the anti-Islamic rhetoric, which was quite disturbing and quite widespread across the political spectrum, Now they kind of keep stum a bit about that. I get the sense that, and this is just my interpretation, that the EU is trying to hold this bloc together with, and it's being pulled by the likes of Hungary further out to the right. And people are, as I say, it's the new normal. You kind of had to accept that the immigration is going to be different now after that great shock in 2015.
Well, speaking of new normals, Michael, before we let you go, there is some other news I have to ask you about, because I understand that the Danish are raising money to buy California.
Yep, they've got 200,000 signatures to raise $1 trillion. They're making a bid, a counter offer, if you like, after Trump has gone after Greenland so blatantly in the last few weeks. It's a satirical website called Danmarkification, where they're making a pitch to the Danes. Come on, let's gather some money together and make an offer on California. And you wonder, why California? Obviously, it's appealing, but have they not noticed things aren't going so well in California these days?
I did wonder that too. Why not
theory,
Texas?
Yeah, I know. I have a theory, Chris. If you work from home during the day, as I do, and occasionally have an idle moment and turn on Danish television during the day, it's nearly always showing The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. So I think the Danes have a slightly archaic view of life in California these days, and maybe that's coloured their view.
I do love that they're also going to call California New Denmark and turn Disneyland into Hans Christian Andersen land. Would be exciting to see that happen. Michael Booth, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. And finally on today's show, it is time for a roundup of news from the Balkans with our man in the Balkans, Monocle's Guy Delany, who joins us from Ljubljana. Good morning, Guy.
Good morning, Chris, and good morning all.
So we're going to start, Guy, with something that I feel like we've spoken about before. This has been an ongoing thing, Italy and its quest to send asylum seekers to Albania. It's not going very well.
It is not. This is the great Albanian asylum adventure that Italy embarked upon. I mean, frankly, a couple of years ago is when this all happened. Giorgia Meloni and her counterpart in Albania, Edi Rama, signed this protocol that would enable Italy to build 2 centres in Albania that would process people's asylum claims and then, if necessary, repatriate people if they were deemed not to have valid asylum claims. And these are people who would be seeking asylum in Italy, in effect, having their asylum claims outsourced. And as you say, Chris, it has not been going well at all. There have now been 3 attempts by Italy to bring people to these centres in Albania to have their asylum claims processed. And every time, courts in Italy have said, no, you can't do this. It's not actually legal. The places that these people have come from are not safe countries, and besides which, processing claims for asylum in Italy, in Albania, doesn't work under Italian law. What's more, we've got a European court judgment coming up on the 25th of February, which is likely to decide the whole thing, whether it's going to be feasible for Italy to carry on trying to do this. And key among all of this, Chris, is the fact that depending on what estimate you read, Italy has spent either upwards of 600 million or upwards of 800 million euros on this project in Albania. That's spread over a 5-year period, but it's still a lot of dosh. And it's not working. The opposition are having a field day in Italy. They're saying, look at the waste of money. Not a single person has been had their asylum claim processed in these very expensive places. Now the latest wheeze from Ms. Meloni and her government is to try and reclassify these asylum outsourcing centres as repatriation centres. This is a very vestigial plan at the moment. We don't know quite how it's going to go, but it rather indicates the abject failure of what they were supposed to be.
Changing a name ain't necessarily going to help. But Guy, just quick question on this as well, or a follow-up. How does Albania feel about all of this?
I don't think Albania gives 2 hoots, to be honest with you. I mean, really, why should it? I mean, it did the neighbourly thing. I mean, Albania and Italy have the proverbial special relationship. Lots of Albanians work in Italy, have done for a long time. In the 90s, in particular, when Albania was making its transition from communism, communist dictatorship to democracy, Italy was a strong ally at that point. Mr. Rama has said that he's grateful to Italy, that Albanians are grateful to Italy, and this was in essence the least they could do. But it's an Italian operation. The part of this whole arrangement is that the centres aren't just paid for by Italy, they're operated by Italian personnel who, frankly, at the moment are spending most of their time kicking back next to the pool in a 5-star hotel. And I'm not making that up.
Well, let's move on, Guy, to something else. Kosovo had elections over the weekend, which is going to make things a little bit difficult because the government currently in power will no longer have a full majority and will need a coalition. What's happening there?
We spoke about this on the briefing the other day in the immediate fallout, Chris. I think it's worth just checking in again on this because the count was a bit of a fiasco. The Central Election Commission's website crashed, which didn't do a lot in terms of transparency. And when people couldn't see how the vote was going, of course, they were quite alarmed. Now, when the dust is more or less settled, I mean, they still have to certify the results, but it's pretty clear that the party of Albin Kurti, the Prime Minister, has got the most votes, around 40%. Nobody else is close to that, but nobody's going to be able to govern without a coalition partner. And boy, are they all at loggerheads. Certainly when it comes to Mr. Kurti and the other three parties which have passed the 5% threshold to get seats in Parliament. This is really uncertain times for Kosovo. And that has an impact, obviously, on the country itself. I think we're going to expect weeks of negotiations, behind-the-scenes shenanigans. One wouldn't be surprised if at least one of the opposition parties changed its minds about working with Mr. Kurti and his self-determination party if they get the right sort of carrot. But on the other hand, we could yet end up with another set of elections. And in the meantime, what this does nothing for is the underlying issue, or the big elephant in the room, which is the tensions with Serbia and with Kosovo's Serb minority, which had the international community very concerned because of Mr. Kurti's shenanigans over the past couple of years, having a very antagonistic relationship with Serbia and being very provocative towards Kosovo Serbs. That's not going to change, or we're not going to see solutions for that very quickly at all.
Well, Guy, just before we go and end our show, I do have one other story I wanted to ask you about because Zagreb has a whole bunch of very fascinating museums that are pretty different from other places in the world, and they've introduced a new one, the Ha-Ha House.
Indeed, the Ha-Ha House. I mean, it's the Susie and the Banshees song, isn't it? The Happy House. But the Susie's Happy House never sounded like a particularly joyful place. Whereas this Ha-Ha House in Zagreb is offering to get people out of the negativity of modern life. And, it's a wonderful place for weird museums, Zagreb. They have sort of caught onto it. It's now become part of the city's brand. And when I say weird museums, I mean things like the Museum of Broken Relationships, which is actually genuinely very good and thought-provoking. There's the Museum of Hangovers, which is slightly less thought-provoking. And then there's things like Museum of Chocolate, Museum of Torture. There's any museum you want in Zagreb, basically. This one, the Ha-Ha House, I have not visited yet. It is brand new. But to be frank, Chris, it looks a bit like soft play for adults, from what I can gather. Because of the story that I'm looking at here, the headline being "Croatia Laughter Museum aims to blow away the blues," has a picture of a woman having just gone down a big tube slide into a load of white soft balls via a gigantic washing machine. Now, I think you can dress this up any way you like, but I reckon this is soft play for adults.
This is basically soft play or an amusement park for adults. But that said, I mean, Guy, I think we all need a bit of a laugh and fun, and we can't just leave it to the kids. We're all big kids at the end of the day. So, yes, I'm fascinated to look at that in Zagreb. We'll have to visit you there one of these days. Guy Delany, thanks very much for joining us here on The Globalist. That is all the time we have for today's program. Thanks very much to our producers, Hassan Anderson and Vincent McAviney, our researcher, Maisie Ringer, and our studio manager, Flynn Simons, with editing assistance from Elliot Greenfield. After headlines, there is more music on the way. I'll be back to host the briefing live at midday here in London. The Globalist returns at the same time tomorrow. I'm Chris Chermak. Thank you for tuning in.